Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad to have you with me here today. One comment that I received over and over again on this video was something along the lines of, "Oh, thank heaven that the 1920s came along and liberated us from all of this tyranny of Victorian clothing." And this has made me want to address some of the misconceptions about the 1920s, because it was not nearly as liberating a time for women as it was oftentimes portrayed to be. In popular culture, the 1920s is usually portrayed thusly. Happy New Year!
Oh my, it's the 1920s. Well, looks like I won't be needing this anymore. Time for me to stop dressing like haunted furniture and start dressing like a bright young thing. Well now, isn't that just the cat's pajamas? Hot diggity dog, is that cocaine?
In reality, there was a long and slow transition between this image and this image. It really began in 1908 with a slight slimming down of the entire silhouette and really picked up steam after World War I. However, this video is not going to be about the transition in fashion. It's going to be about how the 1920s are portrayed nowadays as being the time that liberated women from the general tyranny of Victorian life. There's a very wide misconception that the 1920s saw corsets out of women's wardrobes. However, this didn't actually happen until bias-cut dresses became popular in the 1930s. I have here a fashion catalogue from the winter between 1925 and 1926. It has a full 7 pages dedicated to different corsets. As you can see, these corsets sit very low on the body. They're not designed to create a small waist because women in the 1920s were wearing these drop-waisted dresses that did not emphasize the waist, so there was no point in creating a small one. Rather, they were designed to constrict the hips and buttocks to create a slim, adolescent figure. Compare the 1920s corsets to the corsets advertised in this catalogue from spring and summer 1896. The Victorian corsets sit much higher on the torso and accentuate the natural waistline. Not only in the 1920s were women still wearing corsets, but their corsets were actually much more restrictive and uncomfortable than the corsets that their mothers had worn 30 years earlier. Victorian corsets would tighten at the waist, which is a part of the human anatomy which is naturally unencumbered by many bones and is therefore soft and easily malleable. On the other hand, 1920s corsets constricted around the hips and the thighs. Unlike the relatively squishy flesh of the waist, the hips and the thighs are undergirded by strong bones. This means that any constriction on that part of the anatomy is going to involve the rather painful practice of squashing flesh between bone and corset. Ouch. The long, full skirts of the Victorian era also allowed ladies very free and easy movement of their legs. For example, Victorian women were not taught to cross their legs when sitting down. This practice didn't emerge until the 1920s. Victorian women were taught to actually spread their knees wide, as it was thought that this would create attractive draperies in the skirt fabric. The shorter, tighter skirts of the 1920s, combined with the long lines of these 1920s corsets, they were restrictive almost down to the knees, must have seriously inhibited the ability of the 1920s woman to move her legs freely, or even to sit down. Don't even get me started on going to the bathroom while wearing one of these things. Additionally, in the Victorian era, corsets served as bust support. In the 1920s, they'd crept too low to serve this function anymore, meaning that women had to buy a whole other garment in addition to their corsets, the brassiere. All right, so women of the 1920s were still wearing corsets, and they were likely much more uncomfortable and restrictive than the corsets of 3 decades earlier. However, at least women in the 1920s were no longer swathed in miles and miles of fabric, right? Well, it's true that in the 1920s, Western women started showing off more skin than they had for pretty much all of recorded history. But this was not an unequivocally good thing. In fact, this is where the most insidious aspect of the 1920s rears its ugly head. We're going to split this next section of the video into 2 parts: shaving, body odor, and cosmetics, and body size and the fashionable ideal. In the 1920s, women began to show off skin, and sure, you could argue that this is a good and liberating thing, but as soon as you display a part of your body, you begin to worry about it, and advertisers were very quick to pick up on this. While there certainly were beauty products for sale in the 19th century, the advertisements tended to stick more on the tack of saying, buy this thing to enhance your natural beauty. By the 1920s, these advertisers had realized that making people feel bad about themselves is a much, much better way of getting them to spend money. Thus, they skillfully created insecurities, many of which are still with us today, and sold women products to help manage those manufactured insecurities. In the 1920s, advertisements become mean. They start to say, are you hairy? Are you smelly? You know your friends are talking about you behind your back. Your marriage is failing, your husband doesn't love you anymore, and it's your fault for not buying our mouthwash. This advertising tactic is still with us today, albeit in a less overt form, and it began in the 20s, and I would argue that it was able to begin because of the fashion changes in the 20s. It's difficult to make somebody feel embarrassed about their leg hair if they're wearing knee-high woolen stockings, ankle boots, and a floor-length skirt every day. Why be embarrassed about something if nobody can see it? For this next part, I'd like to issue a trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about restrictive eating disorders. If you think that this will be troublesome for you, feel free to click off the video or skip to this timestamp. The 1920s also saw the beginning of an extremely low body weight being the fashionable ideal. In the 19th century, and for most of Western history, the ideal body weight had tended to hover somewhere around what we today would call a healthy weight. The period sources generally don't specifically talk about a healthy weight. However, if you look at fashion illustrations of the time, you can see that a BMI of somewhere between 18.5 and 29.4, give or take, was the fashionable ideal. And this is what, by today's standards, is considered to be a healthy weight, a BMI of 18.5 to 29.4. Although there were certainly products advertised in the 19th century to help you lose weight, you also see advertisements for products that will help you to gain weight. But in general, you don't see advertisements for products that will help you change your body. You see advertisements that will help you reach the ideal silhouette in other ways. If you didn't have the correct body shape in the 19th century, some judiciously applied padding could always bring you into that ideal. In the 1920s, a healthy body size was no longer considered to be the ideal, and curves became unfashionable. Because curves were out, you could no longer achieve the fashionable silhouette by padding. The only way was to be thin, and this really saw the beginning of dangerous fad diets and the entrenchment of restrictive eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge restrict cycles. Now, I should point out that these diseases have been around for centuries, and there was actually a lot of research into anorexia nervosa in the 1870s, although it was known by several different names at that point in time. However, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the focus on extreme thinness that we have even today began in the 1920s, and that the current epidemic of restrictive eating disorders really began at this time. In the late 19th century, the ideal woman was healthy and reasonably active, and don't try to bring up consumptive chic, because first of all, there's very little evidence for consumption actually being romanticized in the 19th century, and if it was romanticized, that was certainly much more in the mid-19th century, not the late 19th century, which is what I'm talking about. By the 1920s, the ideal woman was an insecure skeleton dancing the Charleston. Many of the famous reforms that supposedly happened at that time, like women casting off their corsets, actually didn't happen until later on, and I would argue that casting off of corsets is not necessarily a good thing. I think they're way more comfortable than brassieres, but that's just my opinion. And some of the reforms that did actually happen, like the shortening of skirts, were maybe not actually very good for women. So in light of this information, I would argue that we should take the 1920s off of its pedestal as being the era of reform, at least the era of fashion reform. The 1920s is also when buying on credit really started to take off, and buying on credit is fun in the moment, but it does have a pesky tendency to lead to economic recessions down the line. Also, Coco Chanel was a Nazi. All right, I think we're going to leave this rant here. A huge thank you to the people who supported this channel on Patreon: Mary Royal, Kit Kat Stitch, Sandra White, Emily Donnelly, V. Birchwood, Kiara Craft, Patricia Bentley Fay, Amanda Martin, Mary Reed, and Heather C. If you would also like to support this channel on Patreon, you can sign up down below. No hard feelings if you can't, I completely understand it, money's tight. But there will be hard feelings if you don't follow me on Instagram, because unlike Patreon, Instagram is free. So that will be linked down below. And my email will also be linked down below if you need to get in touch with me for any reason. Please don't forget to like, comment, ring that notification bell. Make sure that you're, oh, and subscribe. That's the other big thing. Subscribe and then turn on the notification bell so you can get notified of any new uploads. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.